On the morning her grandmother had warned her about the morning Clara Ashford would carry in her chest for the next 40 years like a stone she never put down, she woke before dawn and counted the money in the tin box twice. $18, 7 pennies, and a brass button from Thomas's winter coat that she had no practical reason to keep, and every human reason she could not explain. The first count had been wrong. The second count was somehow worse. She pressed the lid down with her thumb, set the box on the shelf above the coal stove, and stood in the dark of the kitchen listening to the silence of a house that had once held 4 people breathing and now held 3. Outside, the Ozark Hills stretched brown to the horizon in every direction she cared to look. 60 days without rain. 60 days of watching the garden die by inches, the bean plants first, then the squash, then the last of the corn going yellow and brittle in the July heat before it had any right to. The potato bin held 6 shriveled roots growing gray tendrils in the dark. The flour sack was empty. The salt pork crock had been empty for 9 days. Clara was 34 years old, and she had been a widow for 1 year, and she had been alone in the way that only a woman with 2 children can be alone, which is to say she had not been alone for a single waking minute, and the loneliness was absolute. Thomas Ashford had filed the homestead claim on this 40 acres 4 years ago, 2 years before he died. The law said a widow could complete her husband's 5-year claim. The law said she had to make improvements. The law said she had to raise crops. What the law did not say, but what everyone in 3 counties understood perfectly well, was that a woman with no water and no harvest and back taxes coming due in October had already lost everything the law said she had the right to keep. Clara understood this. She had understood it since April, which was when she had said out loud for the first time, standing at the kitchen window, looking at the garden hands wet from washing dishes in water her 8-year-old son had carried 2 miles from Miller's Creek, that they were not that poor yet. Her grandmother, Ida Mae Thornton, had told her once in a Tennessee kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs hanging from the rafters, that the single most dangerous sentence a poor woman could say out loud was that one, because saying it meant she already was, and because the sentence was a door, and once you open the door, you walk through it. And once you walk through it, the ground on the other side was different from the ground you'd left. Clara had said the sentence 4 times since April. She knew what the ground felt like now. She heard the sound before she reached the window. Hooves on the rutted track coming up from the direction of the ridge road. She knew the horse without seeing it. She had seen it twice before from a distance, and once up close at the Stillwater Bend feed store, standing hitched to the post, looking better fed than any animal had a business looking in a county where livestock were dying of thirst. The horse was a gray roan, thick in the neckcoat, brushed and gleaming. In a drought year, a man whose horse looked like that was telling you something before he even dismounted. He was telling you that the scarcity everyone else was drowning in had not touched him. He was telling you that the rules governing survival applied to other people. He was telling you in the language that men like him had spoken for so long they had stopped thinking of it as language exactly what kind of man was about to knock on your door. She smoothed her apron. She straightened her collar. She was still standing at the window when Samuel came in from the back carrying 2 cedar buckets, 1 in each hand, water to the brim. He was 8 years old. He had been walking to Miller's Creek and back since before first light, 4 miles round trip, 32 pounds of water, on a body that weighed not much more than twice that, on a stomach that had held nothing since last night's cornbread. His sandy hair was dark with sweat at the temples. His shoulders had begun a slow adjustment that Clara had made herself stop noticing, because noticing it and being unable to stop it was the kind of thing that would crack her open if she let it. "Morning, Mama." She turned from the window. "Morning, baby." "I saw a doe at the creek, down by the flat rock." He set the buckets by the stove with a steadiness that no 8-year-old should have needed to practice. "She was skinny. Everything's skinny this summer." A pause just long enough to be deliberate. "Except Mr. Crane's horses." Clara looked at her son. Samuel did not look back. He was already moving to the wash basin, and she understood that he had said exactly what he meant to say, and nothing more, and that the looking at the floor afterward was not shame but economy. He had learned that skill somewhere in the year since Thomas died in the specific and wordless curriculum that a poor boy absorbs in a county run by rich men. Say the true thing, then look at the floor. Go wash up. Breakfast is cornbread. With molasses, with molasses. Yes, ma'am. From the back room came the sound of small feet, and then Rose appeared in the doorway in her nightdress, holding her corn-husk doll by one arm. The doll was named Pearl, which Rose had decided on the afternoon Clara finished making it in April from last year's husks, and the naming had been followed within the hour by the naming of the chipped blue cup on the shelf, Robert and the broom, Miss Patience, and the iron stove, Uncle Stove. Clara had laughed the first time she heard it. She had not laughed since. Mama. Rose was 5 years old, and her voice in the morning was still soft with sleep. Can we have butter on the bread today? The question arrived the same way it had arrived every morning for 2 months. Clara crossed the room and knelt eye level with her daughter and put one hand against the small, warm face. Not today, sugar. Not even a little. Not even a little. We have molasses. Rose's mouth did the thing it had been doing since May, that small, controlled pulling at the corners, the compression of a feeling that a 5-year-old should not yet have needed to learn to compress. The almost frown of a child who has begun to understand that her mother already carries enough and that crying over butter is a luxury neither of them can afford. Clara watched her daughter make that calculation and felt something move through her chest that was not grief exactly, but was the specific weight of watching someone you love grow up faster than they should have to. Molasses isn't butter, Rose said finally. No sugar, it isn't. The knock came 3 times, short, polite, spaced. The knock of a man who had done this enough times to know that politeness at the door cost nothing and bought a particular kind of advantage. Clara stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. She opened the door. Virgil Crane filled it. He was 42 years old, broad in the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more useful than handsomeness, something controlled and watchful. The face of a man who had learned that the expression most likely to get him what he wanted was one that gave nothing away while appearing to give everything. He wore a charcoal vest over a white shirt, a watch chain in gold that caught the early light, and boots that had been polished that morning. Under his left arm was a leather portfolio. In the breast pocket of his coat, visible above the edge, like a small silver flag, was a Parker fountain pen. His eyes moved once around the kitchen. Clara watched him do it. She watched him take inventory in 4 seconds, the empty flour sack, the empty crock, the 6 potatoes with their gray tendrils, the tin box on the shelf, the 2 children, the worn condition of everything he could see, and file it away behind that controlled face with the efficiency of a man who had been doing this particular accounting for 11 years. Mrs. Ashford. He stepped past her into the kitchen without waiting, set the portfolio on her pine table, laid the Parker pen beside it, the way a card player lays down an ace, not with flourish, but with the deliberate casualness that communicates, I have more where this came from, and we both know it. I'll come right to it, ma'am. $30 for the 40 acres. Deed drawn by Friday, you and the children east of the river by Sunday evening. My husband filed a homestead claim on this land, Mr. Crane. 2 years completed of 5 before he died, which I was deeply sorry to hear. The sympathy in his voice was technically present. A widow may complete her husband's claim under the statute, as you know. I know. Indeed, she may. Something shifted at the corners of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. Provided she makes the required improvements, provided she raises crops. Provided, ma'am, and here is the small matter the statute does not speak of, kindly she has water. His eyes moved past her to the window, to the cracked brown square that had been her kitchen garden in April, to the place where beans had died in June and had not been replanted because there was no point replanting into dust. My offer closes in 3 days, Mrs. Ashford. After that, I'm afraid I have other calls to make. Clara said nothing. The silence did not appear to trouble him. The county will take this land for back taxes in October. You'll receive nothing. And your children? He let the sentence stop there in the particular place where stopping it did the most damage. A man who had practiced this long enough knew that the cruelest thing you could do was let a frightened woman finish your sentences for you in her own voice, in the dark of her own skull, where they would be far worse than anything he could have said out loud. Clara did not touch the pen. 3 days, Mrs. Redfield. He caught himself. The correction was instantaneous. Mrs. Ashford. 3 days. He rose, he moved toward the door. At the threshold he turned, and the smile arrived small and final. A sensible woman will have signed by supper tonight. I've never in 11 years of this work met a widow who didn't sign by Friday. The dust of his horse was still rising above the track when Clara heard the second sound from the other direction, a wagon coming up the rutted road from the east, piled high, piled with the contents of a life compacted into what could be loaded in a hurry. Nora Finch reined up at the gate. She was 67 years old, and she had buried her own husband in March and sold her own place to Virgil Crane 2 weeks ago for $35, which was what he had offered a woman with no children and no leverage, and the fact of it was written in the set of her shoulders. She did not climb down. She squinted through the July glare at Clara standing in the doorway. You sign yet, Hannah? She stopped, shook her head at herself. Clara, Lord, you sign yet? No, ma'am. Sign. The word came out flat and tired, the word of a woman who had already used up her arguments on herself. There's nothing out here worth dying on. Not a stone, not a tree, not 40 acres of Ozark rock pile. You take his $30 and you get those babies to your people before cold weather finds you empty. I don't have people, Mrs. Finch. Nora Finch looked at her for a long moment, the way a woman looks at another woman when she recognizes something she cannot fix and cannot leave alone. Then she released a breath that had been held a long time. God help you, child. The wagon rolled east. Clara stood in the doorway until the dust was gone. Then she closed the door and leaned her back against it and slid slowly down until she was sitting on the floor, back against the wood legs straight out in front of her on the swept pine boards. She did not cry. Samuel was at the wash basin still washing, and Rose was at the table humming to Pearl, and Clara had made herself 2 promises the morning Thomas died, the morning the doctor came out of the back room and said the 3 words that broke the world in half, and one of those promises was that her children would never see her break. She had already broken the first promise. There had been no butter in 2 months. She would not break the second. She got up. She opened the stove. She laid in kindling. She began the cornbread. That night, after both children were asleep, Clara sat at the pine table with a single tallow candle and did the thing she had done every night for 2 years when she did not know what else to do. She brought down the notebook. It was her grandmother's Ida Mae Thornton's, and it had been handed to Clara at the graveside in the Tennessee hills 2 years ago, when Ida Mae was buried at 81. The leather cover was cracked at the spine. The pages had gone the color of weak tea. Ida Mae had written in it for 50 years in 2 distinct hands, the hand of her youth round and deliberate, each letter formed with the care of someone who had learned to write late and wanted to show it, and the hand of her age slanted and spare, a hand that had stopped performing and started simply recording. 50 years of planting, rotations, water finding weather patterns, legal notes on property rights, remedies, preserving methods, the working knowledge of 4 generations of women who had survived on marginal land by understanding that land more precisely than the men who claimed to own it. The letter pinned to the cover had been in Ida Mae's old slanting hand to my Clara. Read it when you need it, not before. Clara had not read it. For 2 years she had not opened it because for 2 years the need had not come, or she understood this now sitting at the pine table with the candle burning low, because she had been afraid the need would come, and she had not yet been ready for what the notebook would ask of her. You could not read a dead woman's careful instructions and then do nothing. The reading was a commitment, and Clara had not been ready to commit. She was ready tonight. She opened the book at random, the way you open a Bible when the specific passage you need is not one you can name. Let the pages fall where they would, and the pages fell open to a page she did not remember having seen before, or a page in the old slanting handing faded to near brown, written in the small and certain way of someone setting down something they needed the person who came after them to understand before anything else. Where the biggest tree stands on dry ground, there is water running where eyes cannot see. Don't ever forget that sugar. The tree is just the cup the earth drinks out of. Clara lifted her head. Through the small window, the Ozark night was silver under a three-quarter moon, the ridgeline sharp against a sky so clear it looked cut. And there on the slope above the cabin, the same slope she had looked at every morning for 700 mornings, the same slope Thomas had first put a plow, into the same slope she had stared at through the window, while the garden died and the crock emptied and the flour sack went flat, stood the oak. It had always stood there. It would have been easier to say she had never noticed it, but that was not quite true. She had noticed it the way you notice a mountain when you live in the mountains as background, as given as the thing that has always been there, and therefore does not require attention. The oak was older than Missouri statehood, 4 feet across at the base, a crown spreading 120 feet in every direction. And in a summer when every other tree in 3 counties had gone, the color of old paper, the oak's leaves were dark green. Deep, full, almost aggressive green. The green of a thing that is not struggling. Clara sat very still at the pine table with the candle guttering in its own pooled wax. She was 10 years old again. Not remembering being 10 years old, but actually being 10 years old in the specific way that certain memories return, not as images, but as physical fact. The bare feet on a Tennessee hillside in July, the smell of ironweed and dry creek gravel, the sound of her grandmother's voice, which was not a soft voice and was never used for softness. Ida Mae Thornton had her by the wrist, pressing a forked willow switch into her palm. The switch was fresh cut and still pale, and it sat in Clara's hand at first the way any stick would sit, inert and slightly embarrassing. The tree isn't hiding the water, baby. The tree is drinking it. Same as us. You learn to see what's feeding something that big, you'll never be thirsty in this life. And then Ida Mae's other hand skin like brown paper over bone. The skin of a woman who had worked outside for 60 years had pressed against Clara's forehead. Most people look at a tree and see a tree. You look at a tree and see the river they can't find. They had walked up that Tennessee hillside together, Clara holding the willow switch and feeling faintly ridiculous, until they reached the hollow beside an old sycamore where the ground was slightly lower than the surrounding earth. The switch had moved in Clara's hand, or she had imagined it moving. She had never been entirely sure. And Ida Mae had said dig, and they had dug, and at 6 feet there had been water cold and clear, welling up through the clay in the patient way of things that have been there a very long time, waiting to be found. Clara had walked back down the Tennessee hillside holding Ida Mae's hand for the first time in her life. She had been afraid of her grandmother until that afternoon. After that afternoon, she had understood that the fear and the love were the same thing wearing different faces. She came back to herself at the pine table. The candle had burned to a half-inch stub. Her palm was pressed flat against the open page of the notebook. She looked out through the small window at the dark silhouette of the oak on the hillside, its crown enormous against the moonlit sky, its leaves the impossible deep green of something that has its roots in water nobody else knows about. She closed the notebook. She blew out the candle. She did not sign the paper that was not there to be signed. Crane had not left. One had only left the threat of one, and she did not sleep. She stood at the window until after midnight, watching the moonlight on the slope, watching the oak, the way you watch something once you have finally understood what you are looking at. The storm came down from the north sometime past midnight. It announced itself first as heat lightning behind the northern ridge silent flares that lit the undersides of clouds she hadn't known were gathering. Then the wind shifted. Then the temperature dropped in the particular sudden way of Ozark summer storms, the air going from thick to sharp in the space of 10 minutes, and Clara, who had grown up in weather like this, went to both children's beds and checked that they were covered before she went back to stand at the window. By 1 in the morning, the wind had turned serious. By 2, the oak on the hillside was bending in a way that no tree of that age and size should have been bending, great slow arcs that suggested the wind was finding something loose at the root, some purchase that had been working free for longer than the storm. Clara watched it and felt something tighten in her middle that was not quite fear, or was fear of a specific and unnameable kind. The fear you feel when you understand that something very large and very old is about to change, and you cannot know yet whether the change is catastrophe or answer. At 2:15, the sound came. It was not quite a sound. It was a feeling through the soles of her feet where they stood on the pine floorboards, a deep vibration that traveled through the foundation logs and up through the walls, a low groan from somewhere beneath the hill itself, as though the earth were remembering something it had spent years trying to put away. Then the crack, enormous and clean. Then the rolling crash that came down the hillside and seemed to pass directly under the cabin floor and went out the other side and was gone. Rose screamed from the back room. Clara was already moving. She sat on the edge of her daughter's bed with Rose in her arms. Before the echo had finished, one hand pressed to the back of the small head voice at the child's ear. Hush, sugar. We're all right. Mama, the house shook. It's just weather, baby. Just weather. Samuel appeared in the doorway of the back room, not frightened, or rather managing his fright in the specific way she had watched him learn to manage things over the past year, which was to get vertical and assess before anything else. He was 8 years old, and he had the face in that moment of a man trying to figure out what needed doing. It was the oak, he said. It wasn't a question. I think so. Go back to bed. Mama. Go back to bed, Samuel. We'll look in the morning. He went. Clara sat with Rose until the child's breathing went slow and even again, then sat a while longer, her hand still on her daughter's back, listening to the rain that had begun while the thunder moved east, listening to the way it sounded on the cedar roof of a house that needed a new roof and would not be getting one, listening to the long dark rest of the night settle around them. She did not sleep. She sat awake in the straight-backed chair beside Rose's bed, with Ida May's words moving through her like water through limestone, slow, patient, finding every crack, and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes open in the dark. The tree is just the cup the earth drinks out of. Dawn came gray and washed clean the air, carrying the smell of wet earth and ozone, and something cooler than July had any right to produce. Clara had changed out of her nightdress and was wearing her working skirt and boots before the children woke. She told Samuel to stay inside. She told him twice, which was how he knew she meant it. She opened the door. The first thing she registered was the absence. The oak was not where it had been. That negative space, the gap in the silhouette of the hillside where the great crown had always sat, was jarring in the specific way of missing things, the way a room feels wrong when a piece of furniture you never consciously noticed has been removed. Then she saw it. 120 feet of trunk stretched across the middle of her 40 acres, the crown still fully leafed out in that dark green that had been telling her something for 60 days without speaking clearly enough to be heard. The tree had not shattered. It had fallen whole the way very old things sometimes fall, with a kind of completeness, as though it had decided. Along the trunk, the bark was furrowed and gray, each furrow the width of a man's hand. At the root end, where the tree had pulled itself free of the earth it had occupied for 200 years, there was a wall. Clara walked toward it, 15 feet tall, 12 feet wide, a curved shelf of exposed root and packed Ozark soil standing upright where gravity had never intended it to stand, the roots still clenching their load of earth the way fingers clench in sleep. It faced her like an open hand, like something offering. At the base of the wall where the root mass had torn itself free of the ground, there was a crater, 4 feet across, 3 feet deep. Water was rising through the bottom of it. Clara walked the last 20 feet to the edge of the crater and stopped. She knelt in the wet grass without thinking about it the way you kneel when something requires acknowledgement that your body understands before your mind does. She cupped both hands and held them under the seep where the water was welling up through disturbed soil and gravel and something darker, and she brought her palms up full and she drank. Cold, 54 degrees if she had to guess the temperature of deep stone. It tasted of limestone and the mineral patience of things that had been traveling underground for longer than any of the people who lived above them. It was the cleanest water she had tasted since the creek dried to a trickle in June. She sat down in the wet grass beside the crater. She sat there while the sun came fully up, and the temperature began to climb, and the birds started their business in the wet branches of the fallen crown, which was still green and still breathing its leaves, catching the morning light as though nothing had changed. She sat until her skirt was soaked through at the hem, and her boots were wet, and she had stopped noticing either. Where the biggest tree stands on dry ground, there is water running where eyes cannot see. Ida May had written that sentence, and Ida May's mother had likely told it to her, and Ida May's mother's mother had likely told it to Ida May's mother, in a chain of women passing down the knowledge that the land gave them because the land was what they had. And somewhere in the transfer, the knowledge had become almost mythic, had accumulated the weight of many repetitions, and Clara had let it sit in a leather notebook on a shelf for 2 years because she had not been ready to understand it as instruction. She understood it now as instruction. The sound of the cabin door opening reached her. Then small bare feet picking down the wet hillside with the particular confidence of a child who has been told to stay inside and has waited out the reasonable interval. Samuel stopped 10 feet behind her. "Mama." His voice was careful with something that might have been awe. "The tree. I see the tree. Mama, there is water. I see the water." He came and stood beside her. He looked at the root wall. He looked at the crater with its welling spring. He looked at the root wall again, his head tilting the way his father's head used to tilt when he was working something out. "Then, Mama, it looks like a house with no front." Clara put her hand on the top of his head, her palm against his damp, sandy hair. The sentence sat in her chest for a moment before she answered it. "That's because the front hasn't been built yet." By 9 o'clock, the first person came past on the Ridge Road. Albert Garrett, who ran the general store in Stillwater Bend and did a circuit of the ridge every week to see what the county had lost and gained, reined his horse up at the edge of the property and took in the sight of the fallen oak with a long look and a clicking sound of his tongue. "Pure ruin, Mrs. Ashford. Pure ruin." He shook his head at the 120 feet of timber lying across her fields. "Should have taken Mr. Crane's offer yesterday, ma'am. He won't give you 30 now, not with all this mess to clear." Clara was standing on the hillside between Garrett and the crater, which was not visible from the road at that angle. She had arranged herself that way without making it look like arrangement. "I'll let him know when I see him," she said. "That'll be Thursday. He's out collecting signatures all week." Garrett pulled his hat brim down against the angle of the sun. "Condolences on the tree, Mrs. Ashford. You have a blessed day now." He clucked at his horse and moved on east. Clara watched until the sound of hooves faded off the ridge entirely. Then she turned and looked at her son, who was standing 2 feet behind her with the particular expression of a child who is waiting to be told what to do and has already decided he will do it without complaint. He was 8 years old. He had been carrying water since before dawn. And in the slow lift of his chin, as she looked at him, she saw something that she recognized from a very specific angle, the angle of looking at Thomas Ashford across a room when he had made up his mind about something, the quality of stillness that was not waiting but readiness. She laughed. It was not a long laugh. It was not the laugh of a woman who had found something funny. It was the laugh of a woman who has just understood the difference between a door closing and a door opening and cannot contain the magnitude of that understanding in any expression that has less force. It came out of her chest like something that had been stored there under pressure, and it lasted only a few seconds, and it was the first sound of its kind that had come out of her body in 13 months. Samuel stared at her. He had been bracing himself to watch her cry. "Go get your sister, baby." "Why, boss fight?" "Because we have work to do today, and we have 3 weeks to do it in, and I need my foreman." "My what?" "My foreman. You know what a foreman is. The boss of the job. That's going to be your sister." He blinked. Then, with the economy of an 8-year-old who has understood something and seen no reason to argue with it, "Yes, ma'am." "And Samuel, He stopped. She knelt on the wet grass in front of him, eye-level hands on both his shoulders. She felt the thinness of those shoulders under her palms and held it steady inside her, not a word to anyone. Not Mr. Garrett, not Mrs. Finch, not the Reverend, not one living soul between here and Stillwater Bend. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. He met her eyes. Why not? Because if people know, Crane will know. And if Crane knows, he'll find a way to stop us before we've started. The understanding crossed his face the way understanding crosses a face when you are 8 years old, and the logic is clean, immediate, complete, without the need for elaboration. He had already learned in the years since Thomas died that men like Virgil Crane did not require evidence to cause damage. They required only knowledge and opportunity. That's exactly right, Clara said. Go get your sister. He ran. She stayed kneeling in the wet grass for another moment, her hands where his shoulders had been, the morning light falling across the fallen tree, and the wall of upturned roots, and the crater, where water was rising at a rate she did not yet know how to measure but intended to learn. She stayed until she heard the cabin door, and then Rose's voice high and questioning, and then Samuel's voice explaining something with the brevity of an older sibling who considers certain things self-evident. When Crane arrived the following morning, he came a full hour earlier than he had the day before. The portfolio was the same. The pen was the same. He had put on a newer coat. The faint black stripe was barely visible in the morning light, but Clara had grown up around women who noticed fabric, and she noticed it. A man who dresses better for the second visit to a widow is a man who expects to close the transaction. Clara met him at the door with her hair combed and pinned her apron clean, Rose balanced on her left hip, Samuel standing at her left shoulder. She had arranged them this way deliberately. She wanted him to see her settled in the doorframe of her own house, her children framing her, the whole composition communicating a solidity that she was not certain she felt, but was absolutely certain she needed him to perceive. 30 days, Mr. Crane. The breath he took was the breath of a man explaining something for what he has decided will be the last time. 30 days changed nothing, he told her. The drought would not break before October. Her children would be thinner, and her cornmeal would be gone, and his price would fall to $25 on September 1st. And he was offering her 30 today as an act of charity he had no obligation to extend. Clara did not move. He looked past her into the house, then out to the hillside where the fallen oak lay across her 40 acres. The root ball 15 feet tall against the morning sky, and from his angle on the porch, the crater at the base was entirely hidden behind the mass of the trunk. He saw what anyone standing in that spot would see. He saw ruin. The smallest smile almost happened at the corner of his mouth. September 1st, Mrs. Ashford. Not 1 hour more, and not above 25. Understood. He studied her face for a moment, with the expression of a man recalculating. Something was wrong with this conversation in a way he could not quite identify. The widow was not behaving with the texture of a woman who had spent a night understanding she had no options. She was behaving with the texture of a woman who had slept. This was anomalous, and Virgil Crane had not survived 11 years of this work without learning to pay attention to anomalies. But he had also never met a widow who knew something he didn't know. And so the anomaly got filed somewhere slightly below the surface where things go, when you believe your model of the world more than you believe the evidence in front of you. And he tipped his hat and walked back to his horse. The horse had barely turned onto the ridge road before Clara was on her knees on the cabin floor, the notebook open across her lap, her 2 children crouched on either side of her like small conspirators in a plan they had not yet been fully briefed on. Look here, she said, both of you. She turned the pages with fingers that were not steady, moving through 50 years of Ida Mae Thornton's accumulated knowledge. Your great-grandmother was a farmer's daughter in Tennessee. Her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her mother, and every one of them wrote things down. What does it say, Mama? Samuel's voice was low and serious. It says that after a severe drought, a major storm can open the ground. It says the earth has memory of its own water, and releases it when pressure changes. She found the passage she was looking for, the old slanted hand, the faded ink. It says a new spring will take 3 weeks to settle. After that, it will flow as long as the limestone holds. Mama, Rose clutching Pearl to her chest with one arm and leaning in with the gravity of a child who has appointed herself to take this meeting seriously. What's limestone? Clara looked at her daughter. The question was so earnest, so specifically 5 years old, so exactly the thing that 5-year-olds ask when they are trying to understand the world with whatever tools they have been given, that it opened something in Clara's chest that had been shut a very long time. It's a kind of rock, baby, a rock that holds water the way a sponge holds water, and this whole hillside is made of it. Did great-grandmother Ida May know about our tree? Clara looked at the page. She looked at her daughter. Yes, she said. She knew 40 years before we did. How? Because her grandmother told her, and her grandmother's grandmother told her grandmother, and now she stopped. She looked at both of them, at Samuel with his father's careful eyes, and Rose with her corn husk doll, and her serious small face, and she felt the full weight of what she was about to do settle onto her, the way weight settles when you pick up something you've been carrying all along and simply hadn't named. Now, I'm telling you. She closed the book, set it on the pine table, straightened up. We have 30 days. We are going to build something on this hillside in 30 days that Virgil Crane would say cannot be built in 6 months by a crew of 12. We are going to do it with a handsaw and a spade and a hammer and the three of us. And we are not going to tell one living soul until the morning he rides up that track on September 1st and finds us still standing on this land. Rose raised her chin. What happens then? Then we find out what kind of man he is when he doesn't get what he came for. What if we can't do it? Samuel's voice was not afraid. It was asking for an honest answer from someone he trusted to give one. Clara looked at her son for a long moment before she answered, because the honest answer was the only one she was willing to give him. Then we will have tried, and we will have tried together, and whatever comes after that, we meet it together. And I will not sign his paper, not for $30, not for $300, not today, and not on September 1st. Yes, ma'am. Rose, you hear me? Rose raised her hand with the solemn formality of a child who has taken the moment's measure. I'm the foreman. You are the foreman. And what does the foreman do? Keeps the grown-ups honest. That is exactly right. Clara stood. She took the notebook from the table and put it on the highest shelf beside the tin box with its $18.07 and the brass button from Thomas's winter coat. She tied her apron. She rolled her sleeves. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch and looked down at the fallen oak and the wall of upturned roots and the crater where a spring was rising, cold and clear in the morning sun. And she felt not hope exactly, which was too simple a word for what moved through her, but the specific sensation of a door opening onto a room she had always known was there behind a wall she had spent 2 years looking at without seeing. All right, Ida May, she said quietly to the morning to the hillside, to the woman 2 years in Tennessee ground, whose handwriting was still giving instructions. I'm reading it now. She walked down the hill to begin. Day 1 was stone. Day 2 was stone. Day 3 was stone. And on the morning of day 4, Clara Ashford's hands opened in 3 places across the palms, and she wrapped them in strips torn from an old flour sack, and kept working because the alternative to working was thinking and thinking in the direction her mind wanted to go toward. October, toward back taxes, toward the particular quality of Virgil Crane's patience, which was the patience of a man who had never once needed to hurry, was not something she could afford before noon. She had developed a system by the end of day 2, the way a person develops systems when the work is too large to hold in the mind all at once, and must be broken into units the body can manage. The smallest stones went into the flour sack slung across her shoulder, the weight distributed against her back, so her hands stayed free for balance on the hillside. The medium stones she carried 2 at a time pressed against her chest, which left marks on her sternum by evening that faded overnight and came back by mid-morning. The largest stones, the flat limestone slabs she needed for the basin wall, the ones that had been sitting in the hillside since before any Ashford or Thornton had set foot in Missouri, went on a makeshift stretcher fashioned from a horse blanket and two poles she had cut from the thinner branches of the fallen crown on day one. Samuel took one end, Clara took the other, and they counted. 1, 2, 3, lift. 14 steps. Set it down, rest, walk back. 1, 2, 3, lift. Counting was what you did when the work exceeded what effort alone could sustain. Clara had learned this not from Ida May's notebook, but from Thomas, who used to count fence posts. When the fencing went long, count boards when the roof needed replacing. Count anything that could be numbered. When the task in front of him was the kind that would break a man who looked at the whole of it instead of the next piece. She had teased him about it once early in their marriage, and he had looked at her with the patient expression he reserved for things he had already thought through completely. You can't carry 40 acres, you can carry the next stone. She had not teased him about it again. 127 stones by the end of day 7. On the evening of day 7, Clara sat down on the cabin threshold and tried to remove her boots and found that her fingers had locked into the carrying shape, slightly curled, resistant to extension, the tendons along the backs of her hands drawn tight in as fence wire. She was working at the laces with her wrists when Rose climbed into her lap with Pearl and examined the situation with the diagnostic seriousness of a 5-year-old who has appointed herself to keep accurate records. Mama, your hands, her claws. I know, baby. Are they going to stay claws? Clara looked at her daughter's face, which was entirely earnest and entirely without alarm, merely seeking information. Ida May had told her once in the context of something else entirely that a woman who makes a promise she is not certain she can keep has already broken it at the moment of making. I'll tell you by morning, sugar. Rose thought about that. She nodded, accepting the condition. Then she climbed down and went back inside, satisfied it seemed that this was a reasonable framework for uncertainty. Clara sat on the threshold for another 10 minutes, working her fingers open by degrees, watching the last light go off the hillside. That night, she soaked both hands in a bowl of water drawn from the crater. 54 degrees, cold enough to be medicinal, the temperature of stone that has never seen sunlight. The cold traveled up her forearms and into her shoulders, and found its way eventually into the locked places in her chest that she had been keeping shut since the morning the doctor came out of the back room and said those 3 words. She held her hands under until she could not feel them. Then she dried them on her apron and opened the notebook and read for 20 minutes, and then she turned to the blank pages at the back and took up the pencil and wrote the things she had been carrying all day without a place to put it, Ida May. I don't know if this will hold. I'm doing what you told me. If it doesn't hold, I need you to know I tried. Forgive me if I'm not enough. She closed the book. She put her head down on her arms beside it. She was asleep before she had made the decision to sleep, and she stayed that way until Rose padded out of the back room at some dark hour and laid one small, warm hand on the back of her neck and announced with the matter-of-fact concern of a child who considers it her professional responsibility to manage her foreman duties around the clock. Mama, your candle's gone out. Clara raised her head, found the matches, lit a new one, looked at the page she had written on, and then closed the notebook again and went back to work. By day 10, the cabin walls were up. 14 oak posts 8 feet tall and 4 inches across, cut from the smaller limbs of the fallen tree with Thomas's long-handled handsaw. Clara had sawed every one herself. The saw had gone dull twice. She had sharpened it with the file her grandfather had given Thomas at their wedding, a tool that had outlasted both men, its handle worn smooth along the grip. Each post went into the ground 18 inches tamped with a flat stone checked for plumb, with the level Thomas had kept hung on a nail in the old shed. The work was exact in the way that work must be exact when you are building something you intend to stand in for longer than the crisis that produced it. On the evening of day 9, sitting cross-legged in the dirt with the file laid across her knees, drawing it along the saw teeth at the angle Ada May's notebook specified for a cross-cut blade, Clara became aware that she had not cried for Thomas in 9 days. Not because the missing had diminished, it would not. She understood by now that it was simply part of the architecture of her days, load-bearing, impermanent, but because its quality had changed. For 12 months, the grief had been a pressure from behind, pushing her into whatever was in front of her, whether she was ready for it or not. Now in the ninth day of physical work that left her too tired for anything but the next task and then sleep, it had started to pull instead, to draw her forward rather than drive her. She did not have a name for this distinction, but she felt it in the quality of the silence when the children were asleep and she was alone with the file and the saw and the noise of the Ozark night coming through the open door. It was the difference, she thought, between a guest you are afraid to let into the house and one you have finally set a plate for. The roof went on after the wall's cedar shakes split from the fallen crown with a froe Clara had found in the back of the shed. She drove each off to shake with Tag Thomas's hammer, the one he had bought new at the Stillwater Bend hardware store in the year they were married, the handle worn smooth and darkened, where his right hand had held it 10,000 times. She had matched her grip to the shape his grip had made, and the fit was not quite right, her hand being smaller, but close enough that the swing felt familiar, in the way that another person's familiar things always feel inhabited, slightly foreign, more present than absence usually manages to be. Samuel passed shakes up to her, one at a time, standing on the third rung of the ladder with his arm raised. Patient and steady, his timing matched to hers without discussion. They had developed this efficiency without planning it, the way people who work together in close quarters develop shared rhythms out of simple necessity. On the afternoon of day 11, Clara was lying flat against the half-finished roof, her cheek against the cedar, when she heard the sound of hooves on the ridge road. She went still before the thought was complete. The rider was coming from the west at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, the pace of a man doing something purposeful but not wanting to look it. She could see him through the gap between the half-laid shakes, not Crane, not Garrett. A younger man thick through the shoulders on a blood bay gelding that was in noticeably better condition than the animals most people in this county had managed to keep alive through 3 months of drought. She had seen him once in Stillwater Bend. She had heard someone use his name, Cal Dupree, Crane's foreman. She pressed herself flat against the roof and turned her head toward the ladder. Samuel was 2 rungs down, looking up at her with his father's stillness. No words required. He understood. She watched his feet disappear down the ladder and heard very faintly the soft sound of 2 sets of small feet moving into the tree line east of the property. Dupree rode the boundary at a walk. From the ridge road, the fallen oak looked the way it had looked to Albert Garrett 11 days ago, 120 feet of catastrophe. The cabin entrance faced south into the cavity formed by the root wall, which meant the new walls were invisible from the road. The basin she had been building was hidden behind the mass of the trunk. Dupree sat his horse for a full minute longer than a man conducting a casual survey would have needed, and then he turned the blood bay and went east at a trot that was as unhurried as his arrival. Clara stayed on the roof for 10 minutes after the hoofbeats had gone entirely silent. When she came down, Samuel and Rose were behind the cabin. Rose had her arms around Pearl. Samuel had his jaw set in the particular configuration that meant he was working very hard at not asking the question that was sitting on his tongue. Crane's man, Clara told him. He saw some of it. Then he'll tell. Clara knelt to their level. He might not. We can't know, and we can't stop working to find out. We work. Understood? Yes, ma'am. She did not sleep that night either. She lay in the dark listening for hoofbeats that did not come, turning over the image of Cal Dupree sitting his horse a minute longer than necessary, which was either professional thoroughness or something else she did not yet have enough information to name. By 3 in the morning, she had decided she could not resolve it and went back to the notebook instead, reading Ida May's entries on spring development until the candle burned down. The basin went in on day 12. Clara laid the first course of flat limestone in a ring 3 feet across each stone, fitted to its neighbor with the care of someone who understood that mortar was a shortcut that created weaknesses you would not discover until they failed. Ida May had been explicit on this: never dam a spring. Cradle it. The distinction was engineering and philosophy simultaneously, the recognition that water has its own intentions, and that the wise response to something with intentions is accommodation rather than opposition. By 2 in the afternoon, she had eased the diverter stone out of the inlet channel. The spring found the gravel bed in 30 seconds, feeling its way through the aggregate with the patience of something that has been doing this since long before anyone was watching. It found the level of the basin rim. It found the overflow notch she had cut in the eastern face. It began to move down the stone-lined channel she had spent 4 days constructing, running clear and cold along the hillside in the direction of the garden plot. Clara pulled Thomas's pocket watch from her apron and held the cedar bucket at the channel's end. 15 minutes, she measured twice. 3¼ gallons per minute. Samuel made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a whoop and an exhale. The sound of a body releasing pressure that has been building for 12 days. Rose ran both hands into the flow and then lifted them and pressed them against her mother's face, wet and cold and urgent. Mama, it's cold. 54 degrees, sugar. Colder than anything you've touched in a month. Mama, I want to stand in it. You stand in it, Foreman. That's an executive decision and it's yours to make. Rose sat down in the channel in her bare feet, the water coming up over her ankles. Her face turned up to the July sun. She lifted her chin and she began to hum, and then the hum became words, and the words were the words of a hymn low and clear, and entirely certain of itself, rising from a 5-year-old sitting in a hillside spring in Missouri, in a summer that had been trying very hard to finish them. Clara recognized the melody in the first 4 notes. Shall we gather at the river? Ida May had taught it to her when she was not much older than Rose. She had taught it to Rose at 3. Rose had not sung it once in the 12 months since Thomas died. Not at the funeral, not in the weeks after, not at Christmas, not in the long gray months of winter, when the singing of it might have helped. And now she was singing it in a channel of spring water on the hillside, as though the water had reminded her that the song existed, as though the water had given her back something the drought had taken. Clara sat down in the wet grass beside the channel. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry, because if she cried, Rose would stop singing, and she needed her daughter not to stop singing. Not yet, not for one more minute, and so she sat with her palm pressed against her closed eyes, and she listened to the hymn until it was finished. That night, she began the logbook. Oilcloth cover wrapped tight against the damp bound with a length of cord. She wrote by the tallow candle with the small, careful hand she used when she wanted the writing to be legible to someone who was not herself, weighing 12. Flow 3.25 gallons per minute. Channel depth 6 inches. First water reached garden site at 2:40 p.m. She wrote every measurement she had taken and the method by which she had taken it and the time at which each thing had occurred. She wrote it this way because Ida May had written on a page Clara now had half memorized. If you build a thing you may have to defend, write it down as you build it. A pencil is cheaper than a lawyer and tells the truth besides. Clara did not yet know exactly how she would need to use this record, but she understood with the certainty of someone who has been paying attention that she would need it, and that when the moment came, the quality of her preparation would be the difference between the thing she was building, meaning something, and meaning nothing. Day 14, Rose found the green. She was running up the hillside before she was in earshot, her voice arriving before her face was visible over the rise, one word repeated in the key of discovery. Mama, mama, mama. When she arrived, she was breathing hard and her cheeks were the color of late summer apples, and she grabbed Clara's wrist with both hands and pulled. The dead grass is coming back. Along both sides of the channel, for a width of roughly 4 feet in either direction, a thin, uncertain line of green had threaded itself through the brown. Capillary action, Ida May's notebook called it, in the round young hand of the early entries. Moisture pulled laterally through loamy Ozark soil from a constant water source 3 to 6 feet in either direction, beginning within 10 to 14 days. Arithmetic. The kind of arithmetic that looked like a miracle when it came out right, which it had. Clara stood in the July heat looking at grass that had been dead a week ago, and felt the particular satisfaction of something that was supposed to work, working exactly as it was supposed to, and understood that this satisfaction was not simple. It carried in it the weight of Ida May and Ida May's mother and the whole long chain of women who had watched this same arithmetic play out in the same soil in different places and written it down so that the women who came after them would know what they were looking at when they saw it. They slept in the new cabin for the first time on day 16. The structure was 14 feet by 10 feet, the back wall formed entirely by the root mass itself, 15 feet of packed Ozark earth. Still smelling of deep ground, the exposed root ends worn smooth by Clara on day 13, with a piece of sandstone the surface cool to the touch. Even in midday heat, the kind of cool that radiates from things that have been underground a very long time. Samuel put his hand flat against it on the first night and held it there. Feels like the inside of a well. Rose walked the perimeter, sniffing with the methodical focus of a judge at a county fair, and rendered her verdict without hesitation. Smells like wet rope. It does not smell like wet rope, Samuel said. It smells exactly like wet rope, Samuel. Smell it. I don't need to smell it. I know what it smells like. It smells like wet rope and old dirt and something else I don't have a name for. It smells like home, Clara said from her place on the straw tick she had moved from the old cabin that afternoon. Rose considered this for a moment, her nose still directed at the root wall. Home can smell like wet rope. Samuel made a sound that was technically not a laugh, and Clara lay on her back on the straw tick and looked up at the cedar shake roof she had built with her own hands and her son's, and listened to her two children argue about whether their new home smelled like wet rope, and something in her chest that had been wound very tight for a very long time released one complete turn. On day 18, she woke before dawn knowing something was wrong. She did not know how she knew. The knowledge arrived as physical sensation rather than thought, a wrongness in the ambient sound of the hillside, an absence in the particular register where the spring's movement through the channel had established itself as reliable background over the past 6 days. She lay still for half a minute listening. Then she got up and lit the lantern. The channel was nearly dry. A thread of water no wider than her hand moved through the stone bed barely enough to reflect the lantern light. The basin had dropped 2 inches below the rim. Clara knelt and uncapped Thomas's watch and positioned the cedar bucket at the channel's end. 1.25 gallons per minute. The number sat in her stomach like something swallowed wrong. She heard the cabin door and then bare feet on the wet stones of the path. Samuel, in his nightshirt, Rose clutched to his side at the wrist in the way he managed her when he was uncertain and did not want to show it. Clara straightened and turned before they reached the basin. Go back inside. What's wrong with the water? Samuel's voice was steady in the way that his father's voice had been steady when something required steadiness, regardless of what was underneath it. I don't know yet. Go inside, both of you. But Samuel was already crossing the stones toward the basin, his bare feet finding the route he had watched Clara navigate a dozen times, his attention on the water level. And in the moment before Clara could reach him, he extended his left arm to brace against the basin rim. And the flat limestone he caught was the one she had known since day 12 was not perfectly seated, the stone at the northeast quadrant that she had planned to reset and had not yet gotten to, and it came free under his weight. It fell 6 inches, directly onto his left forearm. Samuel did not cry out. He made a sound small, involuntary, the sound of a body registering damage before the mind has had time to prepare. And then he went very still, which was how Clara knew how serious it was, because a boy who makes no sound after that impact is a boy who has learned that making sound brings his mother's face to a particular expression he would rather not cause. Rose, who had seen it, screamed. That was how Clara knew how serious it was before she had even reached him. She crossed the stones in 2 strides. She lifted the fallen slab with both hands. It was not the heaviest stone she had moved this month, but it was the worst she had ever lifted, with the specificity of adrenaline narrowing everything to the weight and what was under it. She set it aside. She took her son's forearm in both hands with the practiced gentleness of someone who has set bones before her fingers, reading the damage through his skin, the way Ida May had taught her to read prayers here, feel here, here, here. Cracked, not broken through. The bone had compressed under the impact but had not separated. Splintable. 6 weeks to full strength, 3 weeks to functional use. Sit still, baby. Rose, get my sewing basket from the shelf. Go now, fast. Rose went. Samuel sat on the basin edge with his jaw set and his face the color of river clay and his arm cradled against his chest. His eyes met Clara's with an expression she had last seen on his father's face, the expression of a man determining whether to be honest or reassuring and deciding after a moment that with this particular person, honesty was the more respectful choice. Is it bad? I've seen worse. It was true. It was also not the whole truth, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. Mama. His voice was careful. I was trying to help. The word broke on the way out, just slightly, the fracture audible, only because she was listening for it, and Clara felt something in her chest turn over completely. Not crack, not break, turn like a stone in a current. And she kept her face steady because the steadiness of her face was one of the things holding them together and had been for a year. She carried him up to the cabin. She cleaned the split in the skin with spring water, which she was clear-headed enough to recognize, even in the crisis of the moment, as a small, specific mercy 54-degree water running cold and clean, pulling the swelling down before it had fully started. She tore a 4-inch strip from the hem of her petticoat. She split a length of cedar shake for a splint. She wrapped the arm from elbow to wrist with the efficiency of someone who has done this and the gentleness of someone who is doing it to someone she loves. Samuel did not weep until she finished. Then he wept quietly into her neck, and Clara rocked him the way she had rocked him at 8 months, and at 2 years, and at 5, and at 7, the rocking that is not comfort exactly, but the physical acknowledgement of one person's presence by another person's body, the oldest language available. And she said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, until he fell asleep in her arms and she laid him down and sat for a moment on the edge of the straw tick, watching his chest move. It was noon before she got back to the basin. She sat on the stone rim with Ida May's notebook open across her knees and worked through every entry that mentioned springs. 3 entries on the first emergence of groundwater, 2 on seasonal variation in limestone aquifers, 1 on silt migration after disturbance. That last one she read twice, then a third time. The storm had churned surface material into the underground channels the spring fed from. As the system settled, as the disturbance that had opened the ground began to equilibrate, the finer particles were finding the narrower passages and beginning to block them. This was not failure. This was physics. And the solution was 2 pages back, written in Ida May's young, careful hand. For a well-gone muddy lay a bed of pebble the size of a baby's fist at the inlet, and the silt will catch there, and the water will learn to find its way through as it does through a sieve. Fine gravel. A filter at the inlet, not the surface. Clara looked at the page for a moment. Then she wrote on the blank page at the back of the notebook, below the line she had written a week ago, I thought I was going to fail him. Then she closed the book and went to work. Day 19, she emptied the basin stone by stone, stacked the courses in sequence, so she could replace them, exactly found the funnel of silted clay at the inlet. With her fingers worked it clear with patient, systematic pressure, and packed a 6-inch bed of pea gravel she had carried from Miller's Creek on day 17, carried it for this exact purpose, without yet knowing consciously what the purpose was, only that Ida May's notebook recommended maintaining a supply of sorted gravel near any water project, and that she had learned to trust Ida May's recommendations without requiring their specific application to be explained in advance. By sundown on day 20, the flow had returned, 3.5 gallons per minute stronger than the original figure, because the silt that had been clogging the secondary channels had now settled permanently against the gravel filter, and the channels themselves were clean and armored against future collapse. The water ran clear and cold down the stone channel and spread its green influence another foot in each direction from the bank, and Clara sat beside the repaired basin in the last of the day's light and put her palm flat on the ground beside the spring as outlet, and felt the faint vibration of water moving through limestone 15 feet below her, and did not have words for what she felt, and so did not try to find any. On day 23, she was teaching Samuel to set a fence post with his one good arm, a method she had devised that involved a specific counterweight arrangement with a forked stick that he had been refining with the focused ingenuity of a child who refuses to be rendered useless when Rose's voice came up from the channel with the tone that meant now. Clara was on her feet before the word was complete. Cal Dupree was sitting his blood bay gelding at the western corner of the property, the corner from which if a man dismounted and took 10 steps into the land, he could see everything she had built. He had not dismounted. Clara walked directly toward him, not running, walking with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has decided that the posture of a person with nothing to hide is more useful than any other posture available to her. Mr. Dupree, Mrs. Ashford. He looked at her steadily. He had the face of a man who has been keeping something behind his teeth for a while and is about to stop. I'm not here on Mr. Crane's business. He doesn't know I'm here. All right. A pause. He looked out over the property at the fallen oak, at the root wall, at the green line along the channel that she had not attempted to conceal, because concealing it from this distance would have been impossible, and the attempt would have been more revealing than the thing itself. He looked at it all with the attention of a man who has been watching something develop and has arrived at a decision about it. My wife died last October, Dupree said. The flatness in his voice was not absence of feeling, but the specific compression of feeling that comes from having carried something in silence for a long time. She was 4 months along. Our first child. He stopped, started again. We needed water. Crane owns the well at the crossroads. He raised the price to 20 cents a bucket 3 days after we told him, and we were foolish enough to tell him to his face that we couldn't afford the land offer he'd made on our 80 acres. He remembered, and he held the price. Clara said nothing. The morning air moved through the grass. By the time I rode to Rolla for a doctor, Ruth had a fever. She lost the baby first. 2 days later, she lost herself. He said it with the economy of a man who has reduced an enormous thing to its smallest possible form because the full-size version is not survivable in conversation. I've been working for him 9 months because I had nowhere else to go, and because I was waiting. For what? For a reason to leave and not go quietly. He reached behind his saddle and pulled down a burlap sack. Seed, Mrs. Ashford. Winter wheat, turnips, cabbage, kale. Crane thinks it's for his north field. He held it out. Take it. Clara crossed to the fence and took the sack. It was heavy, a full season's planting for a kitchen garden, and then some. She held it against her chest and looked up at him. Why? Because my wife's name was Ruth. He said it without ornamentation, the name placed in the sentence, the way you place something breakable, carefully in the exact center, with nothing crowding it on either side. And because Ruth would have wanted me to, and because I've been watching you and your children build something on this hillside for 3 weeks, and it's the first thing I've seen in 9 months that looked like it was going to last. Clara waited. She understood there was more. Crane won't come at you straight, Dupree said. He'll come at you sideways. He'll claim the water is his, that it originates under his property, and you've diverted it without right. It isn't true, but he'll put a lawyer behind it and a document under it, and it will look true long enough to cause damage. He paused. He owns 40 acres 2 miles east on the other side of the ridge. That's why he'll lose if it gets in front of the right person. The elevation difference alone makes his claim physically impossible, but you'll need a surveyor to say so officially. What Judge Obadiah Marsh? He sits in Stillwater Bend on Fridays. He knew your husband. He's the right judge. Dupree gathered his reins. I'll give Crane 2 more weeks before I'm done, so it doesn't look like I warned you. He's thorough, Mrs. Ashford. He'll check. Mr. Dupree, he stopped. Why are you telling me this? The risk to you is real. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has thought this through and arrived at the place past which the thinking no longer helps. Because keeping quiet for 9 months about what happened to Ruth cost me something I'm not willing to keep paying. And because watching you do what you've done here, he stopped himself, started differently. A woman who builds a spring-fed system in 30 days with 2 children and a handsaw will beat Virgil Crane in a courtroom too if she's kept her records and she's ready. I started writing on day 12. Something moved across his face that was not quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood. He nodded once, then he reined the blood bay east and rode out at the unhurried pace he had arrived with, and Clara stood at the fence with the seed sack against her chest and watched him go. She said the name out loud alone to the morning, and the hillside and whatever might be listening from the Tennessee hills 2 states away, Ruth. Then again, Ruth. Because a woman who died because a man held 20-cent water for 3 days while her fever climbed deserved to have her name said out loud by another woman on a hillside that water had saved. Thank you, Ruth. That night, she wrote the longest entry in the logbook. Day 23. Cal Dupree brought seed winter wheat, turnips, cabbage, kale. Flow at 3.5 gallons per minute. Samuel Splint is holding. Rose sang again today. I am gonna win. She wrote the last sentence without qualification and did not cross it out. On day 26, the green line along the channel reached the prepared garden bed. Clara had been watching its progress daily, measuring its lateral advance with a stick and a mark scratched into the channel bank. 6 days earlier, she had turned the garden soil and worked the channel's overflow into the first 2 rows. Now the moisture was moving through the amended earth on its own, wicking into the root zone of the seedlings she had started in clay pots on the cabin windowsill on day 15. She transplanted on day 27 tomatoes at the south end, beans along the channel's eastern bank, corn in the 3 rows she had prepared with the best soil she had on the property. The planting was later than ideal. The plants were small. The growing season was running short, but they were in the ground and they had water, and those 2 facts together were the entirety of what she needed. Day 28. Samuel reset the basin stone with his good arm. He did it while Clara was working the garden, positioned himself at the rim of the basin. With the counterweight technique they had developed together, maneuvered the limestone slab into the northeast quadrant with the patience of a child who understands that patience is not the absence of urgency, but its most effective expression, and had it set and tamped by the time Clara came up the hill at noon. He showed her without comment, which was how he had learned to show her things he was proud of present. The thing let it speak, do not perform the pride. Thomas had worked the same way. She recognized it every time, and it cost her something to recognize it, and she paid that cost every time without letting it show. On the morning of day 30, she was standing in the doorway of the old cabin with the logbook in her apron pocket and both children behind her when she heard the horses. Crane arrived at 7:15. He was not alone. The thin man on the bay mare was Eugene Watts, a lawyer from the county seat whose name Clara had heard twice in the context of contested property, both times on the side that had lost. He carried a leather satchel. His suit was gray and freshly pressed in the way that suits are pressed when their owner expects to appear in a proceeding. And behind them on the blood bay, gelding rode Cal Dupree. Crane dismounted without greeting. His face had the controlled quality it always had, but underneath the control, for the first time since she had known him, there was the faint outline of something that might have been uncertainty. Not doubt about the outcome, not yet, but the first awareness that the outcome was a thing that required doubt. Mrs. Ashford, this is Eugene Watts, my attorney. We are here to serve notice of challenge to your late husband's homestead claim on grounds of illegal water diversion. You are alleged to have tapped groundwater originating beneath my property 2 miles east in violation of established water rights. He held out a folded document. Clara took it, opened it, read the relevant line, emergency hearing. Friday, 11 a.m., Stillwater Bend Courthouse before the Honorable Obadiah Marsh. Obadiah Marsh, the right judge. Friday, exactly as Dupree had said. She looked up from the paper. At the edge of her vision, Dupree raised one gloved finger to the brim of his hat, a movement so small, so specifically calibrated to be invisible to the man standing 3 feet from him that only a person who was already watching for it would have seen it. Clara saw it and understood it with the full weight of what it meant. Everything he had told her was accurate, including the part about the judge, and she was on the right side of every fact that was about to matter. "I will be there, Mr. Crane." He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the second morning, with the attention of a man whose model of the world is showing a small discrepancy it cannot yet account for. She was still behaving incorrectly for a woman in her position. She was still not behaving like someone who had lost. "The court will dissolve your claim. The sheriff will have you off this property by Saturday noon. We will see." He mounted. He looked at her once more from the height of his horse, and in that look she could see him making the same calculation he had made every time he looked at her, the calculation that had always previously resolved in his favor. And she could see it not resolving cleanly this time, the way a familiar equation produces an unexpected remainder, and you go back and check your arithmetic without yet being willing to say you were wrong. He rode down the track. Watts behind him. Dupree last, who did not look back. Clara stood in the doorway of the old cabin until the dust settled on the ridge road. Then she turned to her children. Samuel was looking at the document in her hand with the careful face of a boy who has been old enough to understand documents for approximately the last 30 days. "Mama," he said, "are we going to win?" Clara felt the logbook in her apron pocket, 18 days of entries beginning on the day she had understood that a pencil was the cheapest preparation she could make, each page written with the specific intention of being readable to someone who had not been present for any of it, someone sitting behind a bench who would need to hold the facts in their hand and see them whole. She thought of Ida May writing, "If you build a thing you may have to defend, write it down as you build it." She thought of Ruth Dupree, who had not had 30 days in a spring and a notebook full of her grandmother's knowledge. She thought of Nora Finch rolling east with everything she owned in the back of a wagon. She thought of what she had built on this hillside in 30 days with 2 children and a handsaw, and the accumulated knowledge of women who had been putting things in writing for 50 years so that the women who came after them would not have to figure it out from scratch. "Yes," Clara said, "we are going to win." The Stillwater Bend Courthouse had been built in 1871 from local brick, 2 stories on the corner of Main and Elm, the kind of building that communicated permanence without elegance, authority without beauty. Clara had passed it perhaps 40 times in her years in this county and had never once had reason to go inside. She went up the 3 worn limestone steps on a Friday morning in late August, with Samuel on her left and Rose on her right, and the weight of the logbook and the burlap sack she carried felt different from the weight of stones. It felt like something she had been building toward without knowing it from the moment she first put pencil to paper on day 12. She wore the dress she had been married in, gray wool plain collar, small covered buttons down the front. It was too warm for the end of August in Missouri, and she wore it anyway because it was the best thing she owned, and because walking into a room where a man intended to take everything from her required the best thing she owned, regardless of the temperature. Samuel's left arm was out of the cedar splint. She had removed it 2 days ago, checking the bone with careful fingers, satisfied with what she felt, but he held it slightly bent at the side. Protective habit that would take another few weeks to disappear. Rose carried Pearl. Clara carried the burlap sack containing the oilcloth logbook, Ida May's notebook, a mason jar of spring water, sealed with a wax-dipped cork, and 1 tomato red and heavy picked from the garden at 6 that morning. She had not told the children about the tomato. She had put it in the sack because she was not entirely certain she would need it, and because she was entirely certain she could not afford to leave it behind. Judge Obadiah Marsh was already on the bench when they entered. He was 71 years old, white-haired, with the clear blue eyes of a man who had been looking at the truth for so long that his face had arranged itself around the habit. He had presided over this county's legal business for 23 years. Clara had seen him 3 times in her life. The third time had been at Thomas's funeral, where he had stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in both hands and said nothing to her because there was nothing adequate to say, but had pressed her gloved hands between his own with a firmness that communicated something she had filed away without examining the way you file away things you are not yet ready to use. Crane sat at the plaintiff's table with Watts beside him, the leather satchel open, papers arranged with the precision of a man who has done this before and found that the appearance of preparation is half the argument. Clara went to the defendant's table, settled the children on the bench immediately behind her, placed the burlap sack at her feet, and folded her hands on the table surface. She did not open the sack yet. She had thought carefully about the sequence in which things would be required. Judge Marsh brought the gavel down once. Watts rose. He spoke for 11 minutes. Clara counted. He used the phrase illegal diversion 4 times and unlawful appropriation of subsurface water 6 times, and this grieving widow almost certainly unaware twice, as though she were not present and audible in the same room. The performance was technically proficient, the structure of it, the language precise, the narrative internally consistent. It was the narrative of a man who owned water and a woman who had stolen it, and if you did not know the land or the geology or the elevation of the relevant properties, it was entirely believable. The witness Watts called was named Ralston. He identified himself as a mineral consultant, gave his location as Springfield, and testified with the confidence of a man accustomed to being believed that the underground aquifer feeding the Crane well at the crossroads and the spring on the Ashford property shared a common source. He used technical language at the level of specificity that sounds authoritative to someone unfamiliar with the subject and reveals itself as approximate to someone who has been reading Ida Mae Thornton's water entries for 30 days. Clara listened to every word. She did not write anything down. She did not need to. Ralston stepped down when Judge Marsh turned to the defendant's table with the expression of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that what happens next is sometimes more interesting than what just happened. Mrs. Ashford, you may respond. Clara stood. Thank you, Your Honor. I have a response, but first a request. The white eyebrows rose by the precise increment they had risen in the field survey scenario she had been rehearsing in her mind for 4 days. She had thought about this moment more carefully than she had thought about anything since the night she opened Ida Mae's notebook and understood what she was looking at on the hillside. With the court's permission, I would ask that no ruling be made on Mr. Ralston's testimony until this court has seen the property itself. If Your Honor will agree to adjourn to the land in question, I will demonstrate why the Ashford Spring and the Crane Well cannot by any known physical principle share a common water source. And I will show the court what has been built on that land in 30 days under the legal standard of beneficial use. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has been said in a space designed for the expected. Your basis, Mrs. Ashford, regarding physical principle. Elevation, Your Honor. The silence that followed was of a different quality from the first, not surprise this time, but the specific attention of a man recalibrating. Judge Marsh looked at her for a measured moment, then he turned to the plaintiff's table. Mr. Watts, any objection to the court conducting a site inspection? Watts opened his mouth, closed it. The calculation behind his eyes was visible for just a moment, the calculation of a lawyer who has prepared for the argument that was filed and has not prepared for the argument that is standing in front of him. Your Honor, my client is prepared to rest on Mr. Ralston's expert testimony. Mr. Watts, I asked whether there is an objection to a site inspection, not whether your client prefers to avoid one. A pause. No objection, Your Honor. Good. Bailiff, I'll need the county surveyor, Henry Willis, within the hour. Mr. Crane, I will require the use of your carriage. This court stands in recess until 2 o'clock at the Ashford property. The gavel came down. Crane's face did not change in any way that could be specifically identified, but the overall impression it gave changed entirely the way a landscape changes when the light shifts. Same features, different meaning. They rode out in a procession that Clara would remember for the rest of her life in its specific absurdity. Judge Marsh in the lead vehicle, his clerk beside him holding a leather document case. Henry Willis, the county surveyor, in his own rig with the brass theodolite in its wooden box. Crane and Watts in the Crane carriage. And Clara with Samuel and Rose in the back of that same carriage, which Crane had not been able to refuse without making the refusal itself into evidence. Nobody spoke during the ride. Rose sat between Clara and Samuel with Pearl on her lap and looked out at the passing countryside with the philosophical composure of a child who has decided that whatever is happening is adult business, and her job is to be present and quiet until her title becomes relevant. The hillside at 2 o'clock in August afternoon light was not the hillside of early morning or the hillside of the storm's aftermath. The summer's work had changed it. The channel ran full and bright along the contour of the slope. Its stone banks cleaned the green line on either side, now wide enough to be unmistakable from a distance, a ribbon of living color across terrain that was still brown and struggling everywhere else in the county. The corn stood 8 feet tall at the north end of the garden. The beans had twined up their poles. The tomatoes at the south end had ripened in clusters, still small from the late planting, but red and legitimate, the color of something that has fought for its existence and arrived. Henry Willis set up the theodolite at the crest of the slope. He worked methodically and without conversation, making his measurements, recording his figures in the small notebook he carried in his breast pocket, measuring again to confirm. Judge Marsh stood at the rim of the spring basin and looked down at the water moving through the gravel bed with the attention of a man who has been lied to in rooms and is now looking at something that cannot lie. He looked at the root wall behind the cabin, 15 feet of exposed Ozark subsoil, its surface weathered now after 30 days of air and sun, the roots settling into a kind of dignity, the whole mass beginning to look less like an accident and more like architecture. He looked at the cabin itself built into the cavity with the root wall as its back cedar shake roof tight and leveled the door facing south into the slope's protection. He walked the length of the channel without speaking, his hands behind his back, his clerk following 3 steps behind with the parasol. He walked it all the way to the garden and stood at the south end looking at the tomatoes. Then he turned and walked back and stopped at the basin and held out his hand. Clara gave him the logbook. He read for 11 minutes. She watched him read the way you watch something important that you cannot control, with the specific discipline of allowing the thing to happen without interference. He read the daily entries in her careful hand, the measurements and observations and calculations, the record of flow rates and channel depths and planting dates and germination notes, 18 days of documentation that began on the day she had understood that the act of building and the act of proving were the same act performed simultaneously or not at all. His expression did not change while he read. His clerk held the parasol steady. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the fallen oak's decaying crown. Judge Marsh closed the logbook and returned it to Clara. He turned to Willis. Willis cleared his throat. Your Honor, the Crane well at the crossroads sits at an elevation of 1,147 feet above mean sea level. The Ashford Spring measures at 1,100 feet. The Crane well is therefore 47 feet higher in elevation than the Ashford Spring, and the 2 points are separated by a distance of 2 miles with a limestone ridge between them rising to 1,280 feet at its crest. He paused. For the Ashford Spring to draw water from the Crane well, that water would need to flow uphill for 2 miles through solid limestone. Water does not do that, Your Honor. It has never done that. It is not capable of doing that. The stillness that settled over the hillside was the kind that comes after something definitive has been said in a place where definitiveness matters. Judge Marsh turned to face Virgil Crane. Crane was standing 6 feet to the left of his attorney, and for the first time in Clara's acquaintance with him, he looked like a man who had miscalculated. Not humble, Crane was not built for humility, but recalculating, running the figures again behind his eyes, and arriving at the same unwelcome answer each time. Mr. Crane, your petition is denied on the merits. Judge Marsh's voice had the quality of a door closing, not unkind but final, with the finality of something that has been thought through and will not be revisited. Mr. Ralston's testimony is stricken from the record, and I will be communicating with the relevant bar association regarding the basis of his qualifications. Mrs. Ashford has demonstrated visible, continuous, and thoroughly documented beneficial use of a lawful spring for 18 recorded days in a system she constructed over 30 days by her own labor. He paused. The homestead claim stands. She will complete her late husband's filing in due course. The law is clear. He turned to Clara and tipped his hat in the gesture of a man acknowledging something that goes beyond the procedural. Thomas was a good man, Mrs. Ashford. You are a woman of considerable resource. I am glad to have been of use today. He walked back to the carriage. Crane stood on the hillside. His attorney stood beside him with the leather satchel held against his chest like a shield that had not worked. Crane's mouth opened once found nothing to put into the air and closed. He walked back to the carriage. He did not look at Clara as he passed her. The carriage moved off down the track with the surveyor's rig behind it, and Clara stood on her hillside in her wedding dress with the logbook in one hand and the burlap sack in the other, and the afternoon light falling across everything she had built, and Rose pulled at her hand from below, with both of her insistent, "Mama, can I go sit in the water now?" "Go sit in the water, Foreman. Executive decision." Rose ran for the channel. The drought did not break that afternoon. It went on day 70 day, 80 day, 90. The Ozark Hills staying brown and exhausted while the green line along the Ashford Channel widened, and the corn finished its season, and the tomatoes came in by the basketful, small but legitimate tasting of stone, and the specific mineral patience of deep water. Clara harvested what there was to harvest and wrote it all in the logbook and stored what could be stored and sold what could not. On day 41, Nora Finch came back. She came up the track in the early morning without her loaded wagon, which meant she had already made arrangements for wherever she was staying now that her own place was gone. She walked to the spring basin without speaking and knelt on the stone rim and cupped both hands and drank. When she stood, her eyes were wet in a way that was not from the water. "Name your price, child." 10 cents a bucket, Mrs. Finch. 1 penny less than the Crane well. Nora Finch pressed both lips together and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for several weeks and has arrived at the place where setting it down is the only remaining option. "I told you to sign because I needed you to sign, so I wouldn't have to feel every night like the first one to fold. I was afraid, and I was selfish, and I called it wisdom, and I am sorry." Clara crossed to her. She took Nora's hands, which were the hands of a woman who had worked an Ozark farm for 40 years, rough and capable and currently trembling slightly. "You told me to sign because you'd buried a husband and you couldn't watch another woman bury her hope. You thought you were helping. Clara Ashford, don't you be kind to me. I'm being accurate. Now, how many buckets?" "4. 36 cents. Nora Finch handed her 40 and did not wait for change. By day 60, Clara had 14 regular customers. The Reverend came on Tuesdays for his wife's roses, which were the only roses still alive in a 5-mile radius, and which Mrs. Hale tended with the focused devotion of someone who has identified the one thing she intends to keep no matter what. On the last Tuesday in August, Mrs. Hale came with her husband and sat on the cabin threshold while the Reverend filled his buckets, and she took Clara's work-roughened hand in her own smooth older one and said, "Your grandmother would have been proud of you. Thomas used to talk about her. He said she was the only person he was ever genuinely afraid of, and the only person he ever genuinely loved apart from you." The sentence landed in the center of Clara's chest and spread outward. For a full year, she had waited without knowing she was waiting for someone to say Thomas's name to her in a sentence that was not about his dying to speak of him, as he had been while he was here, particular and specific and known. She had not been able to ask for this because asking for it would have required naming what she needed, and naming it would have made its absence too precise to survive. Mrs. Hale held her hand and did not fill the silence. "Take all the time you need, child. I'm not going anywhere." Clara took the time. It helped. On day 95, she was in the garden with Samuel culling the last of the summer squash, showing him how to read the stem end for ripeness, when Rose's voice came up from the channel with the specific tone that meant something requiring immediate attention. Clara straightened and turned before the second syllable. Virgil Crane was coming up the track on foot. His good horse was gone. The animal pulling the light rig behind him was a single bay ribby at the hip and hollow flanked, the kind of horse that survives a long drought by spending it in someone's care and comes out diminished. On the seat of the rig sat Margaret Crane, and in her arms was a bundle in a blue blanket that was not moving in the way that healthy infants move. Clara had seen Virgil Crane 4 times. Each time he had arrived on horseback with a groomed coat and a portfolio and a pen that cost $8, and each time the cumulative weight of everything he owned had been present in the room before he dismounted. The man walking up her track now had none of that. His vest was open at the collar. His watch chain was absent. He had not shaved. He was 42 years old and he looked older, and he was walking because the animal that had always communicated his status had died or been sold, and he was walking toward the woman he had spent 30 days trying to dispossess because he had nowhere else to go. Samuel moved up beside Clara before she took a step. He was 8 years old and his jaw was set with an anger that was entirely legitimate and entirely his own, and his voice was low and controlled in a way that cost him something. "Mama don't open the gate. He called you ignorant in front of the whole county. He tried to take our home. He is the reason Cal Dupree lost his wife. Don't." Clara looked at her son. She looked at the scar on his forearm, pale now. Against the summer brown skin permanent, the record of a night when he had tried to help and paid for it in the specific currency of 8-year-old bodies taking on adult weight. She felt his anger as the legitimate thing it was and did not dismiss it or diminish it. "Come with me to the gate, Samuel." "Mama, come with me to the gate." He came because he trusted her, which was a different thing from agreeing with her, and he was old enough to know the difference. Rose came too silently, taking Clara's hand, having made the calculation that 5-year-olds sometimes make before 8-year-olds do, that some things a mother does are simply not subject to debate, and the only right response is to be present for them. Clara walked to the gate. Crane stopped 6 feet from it. He was not wearing his hat and could not use the gesture that had always been his closing punctuation, and the absence of it made him look unfinished in a way that nothing else about his diminishment quite managed. Behind him on the rig, Margaret Crane sat with her arms around the blue blanket and her eyes on the bundle in them, not on Clara, not on anything in the middle distance, just on the child, with the total focused attention of a mother who has narrowed her entire world to the circumference of what she is holding. "Mrs. Ashford." His voice cracked on the second syllable. Not dramatically, the crack was small and quickly controlled, but it was there, audible to anyone listening, for the places where a man's composure is load-bearing. "I'm asking." Clara waited. $5 a bucket. 10. Whatever price you set, Mrs. Ashford, I will pay it." He stopped. The next sentence required something from him, that she could see him assembling in real time the way a person assembles something they have never built before without instructions. "His name is Ezra. He hasn't passed water since before sunrise. He's 3 months old." Another stop, then quieter, stripped of everything except the fact of it. "Please." Margaret Crane spoke from the rig seat, not to Clara, to the bundle in her arms, in the voice that mothers use when the only audience that matters is the one that cannot yet understand words, but can hear the frequency of love in them. "Ezra, Mama's here, baby. Mama's right here." The woman in the champagne-colored dress that Clara had glimpsed once at the post office, laughing at something her husband had said, that woman was still present in the architecture of this one's face, the same bones, the same coloring. But the laughing had been replaced by something that had no single name, the compound of terror and exhaustion, and the specific grief of a mother who is watching her child need something she cannot provide herself. Clara felt Ida May's words move through her the way the spring water moved through limestone, not arriving from outside but rising from within. From the place where things that have been carried long enough become structural. There will come a day when the man who tried to starve you comes to your door, starving. What you do that day is not about him. It is about you. Show them who you are, sugar, not who they made you. Clara walked past Crane. She did not speak to him. She went to the channel and filled the cedar bucket and carried it back to the rig and raised it to Margaret Crane, who took it with both hands and began to shake with the full body trembling of someone whose muscles had been braced for hours against an outcome they were not willing to accept. Mrs. Crane, the woman looked up. Wet a cloth first, lay it on his face, not his mouth. Let the skin learn that the water is coming before you try to give it to drink. The skin absorbs faster than the stomach in this state. I don't have we left so quickly, I didn't. Rose. Clara did not need to turn around. Rose was already moving the sound of small feet going fast up the slope toward the cabin. She came back with Clara's own apron, the working apron with the frayed hem and the stain on the bib from the day she had spilled the first jar of tomato preserves, the apron she had been wearing the morning. Crane first laid his silver pen on her pine table. Clara tore a strip 4 inches wide from the lower hem, dipped it in the bucket, reached up without ceremony, and laid it herself across the forehead of Virgil Crane's 3-month-old son. The baby did not open his eyes. Clara tore a second strip, laid it across the small chest, a third along the length of one thin arm. She worked without hurry with the methodical care of someone who has learned that urgency and haste are different things, and that the first is appropriate here, and the second would be counterproductive. She had brought animals back from this edge before. She understood the physiology. She understood that the body, when it has been asking for water for too long, needs to be shown that water is available before it can use it efficiently. After a long minute, a minute that had the specific density of minutes in which something is being decided that cannot be rushed. Ezra's eyelids moved, then lifted. He looked up at the sky above his mother's face with the unfocused gaze of an infant returning from a place adults cannot follow them to, and Margaret Crane made a sound that had no word in it, only the relief of a mother whose child has come back from the edge. She was watching him approach. Clara stepped back from the rig. She turned. Virgil Crane was on his knees in the dust of the track. He had gone down at some point in the last 2 minutes without her seeing it happen quietly, without performance, the way large things sometimes fall. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his son. Mr. Crane, he did not look up. Mr. Crane, stand up. He stood. The effort of it was visible. 10 cents a bucket. She held his gaze with a steadiness that was not coldness. It was the steadiness of someone who has decided exactly what she is and is making certain that the person in front of her understands it. That is what I charge Nora Finch. It is what I charge Reverend Hale. It is what I charge every person who comes to this hillside. I do not have a different price for you. He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he does not know how to hold because he has spent his life dealing in things that had clear accounting exchange rates, property values, the mathematics of other people's desperation. This did not have an exchange rate. He could not file it anywhere in the system by which he had organized his life. I don't have 10 cents on me. I wrote out without. Friday's fine. She did not let the sentence become anything more than what it was. Take 4 buckets today. There is room on the rig. Go home. Take care of your wife. Take care of your son. If you need more on Sunday, come back. Same price. Same terms. As long as this drought lasts. Do you understand me? He understood her. The understanding moved through him visibly the way water moves through dry ground, not fast, not dramatic, but thorough. He nodded because he did not have words that were adequate to the moment, and he had been in the business of words his entire adult life and knew when they were not adequate. He loaded the 4 buckets himself. He walked beside the rig down the track because the bay was too depleted to carry the additional weight on the grade. At the bend where the track curved toward the ridge road, he stopped. He turned back. He had no hat to remove, and so he did the other thing. He bent from the waist a small and careful bow, the bow of a man, acknowledging a debt that has no currency, that will not appear in any ledger, that will be carried in the body rather than recorded on paper. Then he turned and walked around the bend and was gone. Clara raised her hand once, then she turned and went back up the hill to her children. Samuel was standing where she had left him, 10 feet from the gate, still vibrating with the controlled anger of a boy who has watched justice be refused and mercy given in its place and cannot yet fully account for this. His voice, when he found it, was low and careful. "Mama, why?" Clara sat down on this cabin threshold. She pulled Samuel down beside her. Rose climbed into her lap with the ease of a child who considers her mother's lap a sovereign territory to which she has permanent access. The afternoon light lay long across the hillside, gold, at this angle touching the channel and the garden and the root wall and the line of new oak saplings she had planted last week along the eastern boundary from acorns gathered from the fallen crown. Because your great-grandmother Ida May told me something when I was 10 years old and standing on a hillside in Tennessee that I have been thinking about ever since. She said, "Show them who you are, sugar, not who they made you." Clara looked at Samuel's face, at the anger in it that was entirely justified and that she would not talk him out of only through. Virgil Crane came up that track today, expecting us to charge him $5 a bucket, because that is the price he would have charged us. He expected it because he has spent his whole life measuring people by what he would do in their position. And if we had charged him $5, Samuel, we would have proved him right. We would have become his version of us. Samuel was quiet for a moment. The anger was still in him, but it had shifted the way something shifts when it finds a frame that can hold it. "So you charged him 10 cents to prove he was wrong." "I charged him 10 cents to show my children who we are. There is a difference." Samuel sat with that. Rose had her cheek against Clara's collarbone and Pearl against her own, the whole arrangement compact and warm and smelling of sun and creek water. From somewhere down the slope, the spring ran its constant conversation with the stone channel, the sound of it as familiar now as the sound of the children breathing in the next room. Rose, without lifting her head, "Mama." "Yes, baby." Was Mrs. Crane crying? She was. Is the baby going to be all right? Clara looked down the track where the rig had disappeared around the bend. She thought of Ezra's eyes opening. She thought of the tongue that had taken the water. She thought of what 54-degree spring water did to a dehydrated body when it was introduced correctly, which she knew from Ida May's notebook and from the animals she had nursed through summer sickness and from the deep practical knowledge of a woman who has kept things alive on not enough for long enough to understand what alive requires. "I think so, sugar. I think the baby will be all right." "Mama." Rose lifted her head. Her face in the afternoon light was entirely serious with the specific earnestness of a 5-year-old who has arrived at a question she considers important. "When I grow up, will I be kind like you?" Clara put her face in her daughter's sun-warmed hair. She held it there. And for the first time in 13 months and 1 year and 1 month and some number of days, she had stopped counting. Because counting them had become a kind of damage, she let herself cry. Not the shaking kind, not the kind that frightens children. The quiet kind, the kind that comes after something has finished, rather than in the middle of it, the kind that is not grief anymore, but its resolution, the place grief goes when it has done all its necessary work and is ready to become something else. Samuel sat beside her and did not speak. Because Samuel at 8 years old understood the one thing most necessary to understand about a mother crying without shaking, which is that silence is not absence. Silence is the specific form presence takes when presence is all that is needed. The rain came on the 11th of October. A Sunday afternoon, the drought on its 104th day, the sky going dark from the northwest with the specific intention of a system that had been building for a week over the plains. It began a little past 1, and it fell for 11 hours steady and thorough, without the drama of the storm that had opened everything, Just rain doing what rain does when it finally arrives, covering the ground, methodically filling the low places, darkening the soil from pale to brown to the deep, saturated black of earth that has been waiting. Clara stood in the open doorway with Samuel on her left and Rose on her right and watched it come down. The channel ran fast with the addition. The garden drank. The brown hillside began the slow process of remembering what it was capable of when water was present. Behind them, the spring continued at its usual rate, indifferent to the weather in the way that deep things are indifferent to surface conditions, neither increased by the rain nor diminished by the drought, simply present and constant and reliable in the manner of things whose sources are too far down to be touched by what happens at the surface. The Christmas letter arrived from St. Louis in an envelope, addressed in a hand Clara did not recognize as Crane's. He had always used a confident, flourishing script, and this was something quieter, as though the hand itself had been revised. 3 lines. She read them twice at the pine table with the tallow candle, and then folded the letter and placed it inside the front cover of Ida May's notebook. And she did not show it to another living person for the rest of her life. She read it twice a year every year for 41 years, and each time the 3 lines said the same thing and meant more than they had the time before. Cal Dupree came back in the 3rd week of October, 3 days after the rain, with his hat in his hand and a question in his posture rather than his voice. He had heard that Mrs. Ashford might be needing help with the fall planting, given the season that had been. Clara hired him that afternoon. He worked her land for 31 years through all weathers with the steady quality of a man who has found the place where his grief and his usefulness occupy the same ground and has decided to stay there. He never remarried. When he died, he was buried at the top of the hill in the small family plot Clara had laid out in the 5th year on a day when the ground was soft enough and the view down the slope warranted it. 3 stones on that hill. Thomas, Ruth Dupree, whose remains had been moved from the county burial ground at Cal's request the year after her death, and Cal placed beside Ruth at last the geography of death, giving them what circumstance had refused them in life. Clara did not remarry. She did not want to, and she was clear about not wanting to in the specific way of a woman who has examined the question honestly and arrived at an honest answer. Thomas had been her husband. Ida May had been her grandmother. The spring was the spring. The oak's slow return to earth was becoming, by the 7th year, a ridge of loam that ran the length of the property and supported a dense wild growth of seedlings, the children of the tree taking root in their parents' dissolution, the way such things do. In the 5th year after the drought, the Stillwater Bend Grange invited Clara to speak at its February meeting. She had not prepared remarks. She stood at the front of the room with the particular calm of a woman who has stopped performing composure because she no longer needs to perform it, and she looked at the faces Nora Finch in the 2nd row, the Reverend and his wife Judge Marsh in the front, with his hat on his knee, and she said what she knew. The biggest tree in a dry land is drinking from somewhere deep. That is what my grandmother taught me when I was a girl. The tree is not the problem, and it is not the miracle. The tree is the map. Find the tallest, oldest, greenest thing on a hillside where nothing else is green, and I will tell you that tree has its roots in water you cannot see from where you're standing. And what that tree is drinking, you can drink too, if you know how to ask the land. She paused. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that people recognize from somewhere inside themselves. The second thing I would say is this. What people call worthless is very often only hidden. You don't always need to build something new. Sometimes you need to uncover what was already there. Sometimes the ground opens itself, and all that is asked of you in that moment is the presence of mind to see what you're being shown. Judge Marsh began to applaud from the front row, the slow, deliberate clap of a man who intends for others to follow. And they did. The Grange printed both sentences in its spring newsletter. By fall, they had reached 4 adjoining counties. By the 10th year, men in Arkansas and Kentucky and the eastern edge of Oklahoma were saying them as folk wisdom, attributing them to the land itself, to the old-timers, to the general accumulated knowledge of people who had figured things out the hard way over a long time. Clara, when she heard this repeated attribution, never corrected it. The sentences had started with Ida May's mother, or Ida May's mother's mother, and had only passed through Clara on their way to wherever they were going. Correcting the attribution would have been like claiming ownership of the rain. Rose married Young, a farmer from the next hollow, over steady and patient, the kind of man who understood that the woman he was marrying had been foreman of a significant operation at age 5 and intended to remain in management. The two of them built their first cabin on the adjoining slope, using a storm-felled elm's root mass as the back wall, a small spring in the resulting crater, a channel running down to the kitchen garden. The pattern was not accidental. Rose had been present for every day of the original construction. She had the logbook's entries memorized better than she knew carried in the body, the way children carry things they absorb before they were old enough to understand they were absorbing them. Her oldest daughter, when she arrived in the 8th year of Rose's marriage, was named Ida May, without discussion between the parents, as though the name had been waiting for the child, and both parents had simply recognized it when she appeared. Samuel stayed on the home property. He became a man who could read a hillside for water the way other men read a newspaper quickly, accurately, with the habit of someone for whom the skill has become so internalized. It no longer feels like skill, but like simple perception. By the time he was 18, he was being asked to consult on water projects in 4 counties. He taught what he knew without charge to anyone who asked, because Ida May's notebook had a page that said something about knowledge being the one thing that does not diminish when you give it away, and Samuel had read that page at 8 years old and taken it seriously. His last words to his own daughter on a clear October morning, when the hills were orange and the spring was running its usual rate, and he was 91 years old and had outlasted most of the things he had been afraid of, "Make sure the spring gets cleaned in April. Your grandmother would be proud of you, sweetheart." Clara was 74 years old on the September morning she drove into Stillwater Bend for flour. Her hair had been white for a decade. Her eyes had stayed the particular blue that had always been more useful than decorative, the blue of someone who has been looking at difficult things for a long time and has not stopped looking. Josiah Samuel drove the wagon. She did her shopping at the general store with the efficiency of someone who has been doing it long enough to require no deliberation. At the feed counter, 2 men were talking with the comfortable ease of people conducting the portion of their business that is not technically business. One of them was young, 20, perhaps 22, the kind of young that looks younger in retrospect from any vantage point, past 40. He was saying something to his neighbor about what his father used to say, and his father's father before him, about the land and what it holds and how you find what's in it. "The biggest tree in a dry land is drinking from somewhere deep," the young man said. "My granddaddy used to say it like it was common knowledge, like everybody knew it." His neighbor, Old Country, saying, "Must be, old as anything." Clara paid for her flour. She turned. She looked at the young man with the full attention of a woman who has not survived what she has survived by paying partial attention to things that matter. "Where did your grandfather learn that, son?" He looked at her, at the white hair, in the blue eyes, in the expression of someone who has asked a question they already know part of the answer to. "I honestly couldn't say, ma'am. He said it was old wisdom from the hill country, something people just knew." "From the hill country, Katina," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." She considered him for a moment. Then she smiled, not the small, controlled smile of someone who was managing an impression, but the real one, the one that had been unavailable to her for the first 13 months after Thomas died, and had been coming back incrementally ever since, the smile of a woman who has arrived at a place she intended to reach and finds it is what she thought it would be. "That sounds about right, son. That sounds exactly right." She did not correct him. She walked out into the September afternoon and climbed up to the wagon seat where Samuel was waiting, and he helped her up with the easy competence of a son who has been helping his mother in and out of wagons for decades. And he did not ask what she was smiling about, because he had learned 40 years ago that asking his mother what she was smiling about produced answers of a scope that required more time than either of them usually had available. He drove her home. She went into the cabin. She sat at the pine table, the same pine, the wood darker now, with 40 years of use, the surface worn smooth in the specific places where elbows and forearms and the spines of books had been set down 10,000 times. She opened Ida May's notebook to the last blank page, the one she had been leaving for this, though she had not consciously known she was leaving it. She took up the pencil. She wrote in the hand of her age, which was not Ida May's old hand, but her own slanted and spare, in the same way the hand of someone who has stopped performing and started simply recording. A grandmother in Tennessee, a tree in a storm, a widow and two children who finally learned to read what was already there. She closed the book. She put it on the shelf beside the tin box, which still held, for no practical reason, in every human one, a single brass button from a winter coat. She went out to the porch. She sat down in the chair she had sat in for 40 years, the one that faced the hillside, the one with the view down the channel to the garden, and up the slope to where the oak's long dissolution had become a hedgerow of its own children. Little Ida May Rose's granddaughter, 5 years old this past spring, named for the woman in the notebook, came running up the path from the lower cabin with the specific urgency of a 5-year-old who has been somewhere interesting and needs to report. She climbed into Clara's lap without asking, because it was her lap and she knew it. Clara put her hand on the child's head. Below them, steady and indifferent and entirely reliable, the spring ran at 3.5 gallons per minute, the same rate it had settled at on day 20, after she packed the gravel filter into place, the same rate it had maintained through 41 years of seasons, through the births and deaths and ordinary passages of everyone on this hillside, through droughts and floods and the slow, patient work of children becoming parents and parents becoming the people their children would someday remember. Ida May, the small one, the newest one, looked up with the face of a child who has noticed that her great-grandmother is somewhere slightly distant from the porch in the way that old people sometimes go to places you cannot follow them. "Grandma, what are you smiling at?" Clara looked down at the child whose name was the name of the woman in the notebook, who was the age Clara had been when she first held a willow switch on a Tennessee hillside, and understood that the earth was not withholding its gifts, but simply waiting for someone who knew how to ask. She kissed the top of the small head, which smelled of grass and creek water, and the particular sweetness of children who have been running in warm weather. "I'm smiling because your great-great-grandmother Ida May was right." "About what?" Clara looked out at the hillside. The spring ran on below them. The young oaks along the eastern edge had grown tall enough this year to cast a shadow in the afternoon, the shadow of things that have found their water and intend to stay. "About everything, sugar," Clara said. "About absolutely everything." The afternoon light moved across the porch. The child settled deeper into her lap, satisfied with the answer, in the way that children are satisfied when they understand that the thing being described is large, and they are being trusted with the information that it is large. The spring ran on clear and cold and constant, drawing from whatever it had always drawn from the source of it, too far down and too old to be troubled by what happened at the surface by drought or flood, or the long patient turning of seasons by the births and deaths of the people who had learned to live above it. It ran the way things run when they come from somewhere deep. It ran the way her grandmother had told her things run 40 years ago on a Tennessee hillside, in the hand that had written it down so that the woman who came after her would not have to figure it out alone. It ran and would keep running long after the last person who remembered where it came from had gone to join the ground it rose from.